The moment her skin touched the cold metal of the arena gate, Liora Hale knew something was wrong. It wasn't the chill that bothered her, it was the sudden static electricity that danced across her fingertips, sending a shiver up her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Her wolf stirred inside her, restless and alert in a way she'd never felt before. And then the blood moon rose higher in the night sky, casting an eerie crimson glow across the packed arena. The crowd's raucous chatter faded to reverent silence as the combat trials began, a sacred tradition older than the northern clans themselves. Liora hadn't wanted to come, but her cousin Nora had insisted, dragging her along despite her protests. "You can't spend your whole life hiding in the shadows just because your father fell from grace," Nora had said, linking their arms together as they found their seats in the lower stands, close enough to see the fighters' expressions. Close enough to smell the blood when it spilled. Truth be told, Liora had spent years perfecting the art of invisibility. As the daughter of a disgraced beta, she'd learned that attention only brought trouble. She'd learned to dim her light, to quiet her wolf, to exist in the spaces between notice. Her father's betrayal of the previous Alpha King had cast a long shadow over their family name, and Liora had spent her entire life trying to outrun it. From there, she watched as two warriors circled each other in the center of the arena, muscles coiled tight with lethal intent. The first match was always the most brutal, a statement to set the tone for the night. Blood Moon combat wasn't just entertainment, it was politics, tradition, and power all rolled into one violent spectacle. What followed was a blur of movement so fast Liora could barely track it. The larger warrior lunged, all raw power and aggression. The smaller one sidestepped with practiced grace, using his opponent's momentum against him. The crowd roared its approval as first blood was drawn, a shallow slice across the larger fighter's forearm that glistened wetly in the moonlight. "That's Dario of the Eastern Ridge Pack," Nora whispered, pointing to the smaller fighter. "They say he's favored to win this year's trials." Yet Liora wasn't listening. Her attention had shifted to the royal box above the arena where the Alpha King himself sat watching the combat with cold disinterest. King Ryder Kale, ruler of the northern clans, a man whose name was spoken with equal parts reverence and fear. From this distance, she could make out little more than his imposing silhouette and the gleam of the ancient crown upon his brow. Despite that, a strange pressure built in her chest, like an invisible thread pulling taut. Liora rubbed at her sternum, confused by the sensation. Her wolf paced anxiously beneath her skin, and for a terrifying moment, Liora feared she might shift right there in the stands, something that hadn't happened to her since she was a pup first learning control. On the other hand, the crowd seemed oblivious to her internal struggle, their focus entirely on the bloodshed below. Another challenger had entered the ring, and another after that, each fight more violent than the last. It was tradition for unmated wolves to prove their worth during these trials, to show potential mates they were strong enough to protect and provide. More importantly, it was a chance for King Ryder to assess the strength of his warriors. The combat trials weren't just sport, they were a reminder of the brutal hierarchy that governed their world. The strong ruled. The weak submitted. It had always been this way. In fact, that was why Liora avoided these gatherings. They reminded her too much of what she could never have: respect, position, a place of honor among her kind. As a disgraced beta's daughter, she was barely tolerated in most circles, permitted to exist on the fringes of pack life out of reluctant tradition rather than welcome. Not only that, but the blood moon itself made her uncomfortable. The ancient magic that swirled through the air during these nights was unpredictable, known to stir primal instincts and awaken dormant powers. Old stories told of fated pairs finding each other under the blood moon's glow, of bonds snapping into place with such force that neither party could resist. What's worse, Liora had always been unusually sensitive to moon magic. Even regular full moons affected her more strongly than others, intensifying her connection to her wolf. Under the blood moon, that connection felt dangerously close to slipping beyond her control. Moments later, a hush fell over the crowd as the arena doors opened once more. Unlike the previous challengers, this fighter didn't strut or posture as he entered. He moved with quiet confidence, each step deliberate. The silence was so complete that Liora could hear the soft crunch of sand beneath his boots. By the time he reached the center of the arena, the crowd had begun to whisper. He was unfamiliar to most, a rare occurrence in the close-knit world of the northern clans. Tall and lean rather than bulky, his strength wasn't immediately apparent, but there was something in his stance that spoke of absolute certainty. Eventually, King Ryder rose from his seat, silencing the murmurs with a single raised hand. "Who challenges?" His voice boomed across the arena, the traditional words of the Blood Moon ritual. "Alaric of the Shadow Valley Pack," the stranger replied, his voice carrying despite its quiet tone. "I challenge for the right of combat." That night, something shifted in the atmosphere. The blood moon seemed to pulse brighter, bathing the arena in deeper crimson. Leora's breath caught in her throat as her wolf surged forward with such force that her eyes flashed gold, earning a startled look from Nora beside her. "Are you okay?" her cousin whispered, but Liora couldn't answer, too focused on controlling the sudden wildness in her blood. Come morning, she would blame it on the excitement of the crowd, on the magic of the blood moon, on anything but the truth she couldn't yet face. Because in that moment, as Alaric of Shadow Valley prepared to fight, Leora's wolf recognized something her human half couldn't comprehend. But then the combat began, and all thought fled her mind. Alaric moved like water, flowing around his opponent's attacks with effortless grace. There was something mesmerizing about the way he fought, not with brute force, but with precision and strategy. Each move was calculated, each strike purposeful. Instead of the bloody spectacle the crowd craved, they witnessed a dance of sorts, beautiful in its deadliness. When Alaric finally struck, it happened so quickly that many missed it, a blur of movement, and suddenly his opponent was on his knees, yielding with a hand pressed to his bleeding throat. Rather than roar in triumph as the others had done, Alaric simply stepped back and bowed to his fallen opponent, a gesture of respect rarely seen in the arena. The crowd's reaction was mixed, some cheered for the display of skill, others grumbled at being denied the violence they'd come to see. Meanwhile, Liora couldn't tear her eyes away from him. The pressure in her chest had intensified, a pull so strong it felt physical, as though invisible hands were drawing her forward. Her palms were slick with sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. At the same time, King Ryder leaned forward in his throne, his interest visibly piqued by this unexpected challenger. His expression remained impassive, but there was a new intensity in his posture as he watched Alaric dispatch his second opponent with the same efficient grace. Because of that, no one noticed when Liora stood abruptly, muttering an excuse to Nora about needing air. She pushed her way through the crowd, desperate to escape the suffocating pull, the inexplicable draw toward a stranger she'd never met but who somehow felt more familiar than her own reflection. So she fled, slipping through the arena's outer corridors, seeking the coolness of the night air beyond. Her wolf howled in protest, fighting her every step of the way. It wanted to stay, wanted to watch, wanted something Liora couldn't, or wouldn't, name. That's why she was alone when it happened. Outside in the torchlit courtyard, leaning against a stone pillar and gulping down the night air like a drowning woman, Liora didn't see the final challenge. She didn't witness Alaric's third victory, or how the crowd's energy shifted from skepticism to awe. Which meant she wasn't prepared when the arena doors burst open and people began streaming out, their voices raised in excited chatter about what had just occurred inside. Words like unprecedented and challenge to the king himself reached her ears, making little sense until Nora found her, face flushed with excitement. "You missed it," her cousin exclaimed, gripping Leora's arms. The outsider, Alaric, he challenged King Ryder directly. No one's dared to do that in decades. Her body moved on instinct before her mind could process the words, pulling away from Nora and turning toward the arena entrance where a crowd had gathered. Through gaps between bodies, she caught glimpses of what was happening: King Ryder descending from his royal box, warriors clearing a path for him, the circle of spectators widening to create a makeshift ring in the courtyard. Without thinking, Liora pushed forward, drawn by that same inexplicable pull. People stepped aside, too focused on the impending fight to notice the disgraced Beta's daughter slipping through their midst. She moved as if in a trance, each step bringing her closer to the front of the crowd, closer to the two men now facing each other in the center of the courtyard. As the silence stretched between them, tension crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. King Ryder stood tall and imposing, his royal garments stark against the night, his crown catching the blood moon's light. Across from him, Alaric waited, patient and still, showing neither fear nor arrogance before his king. With every heartbeat, the crowd's anticipation grew. This was unprecedented. A direct challenge to the king during the Blood Moon trials meant more than a simple test of combat skills. It was a challenge to his dominance, to his very right to rule. In the span of a breath, King Ryder removed his crown and handed it to a waiting attendant. He shrugged off his formal cloak, revealing the warrior's body beneath royal trappings. The murmurs of the crowd grew as he rolled his shoulders, the subtle shift of muscle beneath his tunic reminding all present that their king had not earned his throne through birthright alone, but through blood and victory. The moment their eyes locked in combat, something electric passed between them: recognition, respect, the acknowledgement of worthy opponents. And then they began to circle each other, two apex predators measuring the other's strengths and weaknesses. Without another word, they attacked simultaneously. The clash of their bodies meeting echoed across the courtyard like thunder. What followed was nothing like the controlled precision of Alaric's earlier fights. This was primal, visceral, two alphas battling for dominance with everything they had. Before either could speak, the crowd had formed a tight circle around them, voices rising in chants and cheers. Liora found herself pressed against others, struggling to maintain her view of the fight. The pull in her chest had become painful now, a desperate, clawing need to get closer. As if fate demanded it, a gap opened in the crowd. Liora stumbled forward, pushed by someone behind her, and suddenly found herself at the very edge of the impromptu fighting ring. Too close. Dangerously close. Between one breath and the next, King Ryder threw Alaric to the ground with enough force to knock the wind from his lungs. He followed immediately, one hand at the challenger's throat, the other raised to deliver a finishing blow. Victory was seconds away. The king would maintain his dominance, the challenge would be settled, and the natural order would remain intact. In the echo of his voice, Ryder growled words only those closest could hear: submit. Before the words left her lips, Liora knew she should look away. This was the moment of another wolf's submission, a private, humiliating thing not meant for outsiders to witness. And yet she couldn't tear her eyes from the scene, couldn't silence her wolf's desperate whining beneath her skin. As the wind shifted, carrying her scent across the courtyard, something impossible happened. Both men froze. King Ryder's head snapped up, his nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. Beneath him, Alaric went rigid, his eyes widening in shock. Under the weight of his stare, Liora felt pinned in place. King Ryder's eyes met hers across the distance, and the world stopped turning. As the truth unraveled between them, Leora's knees weakened. The king's eyes flashed alpha red, his wolf surging to the surface in response to something only he could sense. The crowd fell away, the noise dimmed, and suddenly there was nothing in the universe except those blood-red eyes boring into hers. Between them, something cracked open, raw and ancient and unstoppable. The invisible thread that had been pulling at her chest all night suddenly pulled taut, no longer merely a sensation but a tangible connection that hummed with power. As her wolf stirred, rising to meet his gaze, Liora felt it happen. The bond. The impossible, irrefutable claiming that she'd only ever heard about in old pack tales. The connection that couldn't be denied or broken, not by distance, not by will, not by anything mortal. With a single glance, her life as she knew it ended. Her independence, her anonymity, her carefully constructed invisibility, all of it shattered in the space between one heartbeat and the next. As if summoned by the power crackling between them, the blood moon flared brighter overhead, bathing the courtyard in crimson light. The crowd sensed the shift in energy, their chattering falling to whispers, then to silence as they realized something momentous was occurring. The tension broke when King Ryder rose slowly to his feet, his eyes never leaving Liora's. He moved toward her with predatory focus, each step deliberate, unhurried, absolutely certain. The crowd parted before him without being told, instinctively making way for their alpha. When her name left his lips, it was a question and a claim all at once. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice rough with the effort of holding his wolf at bay. As the sky darkened with clouds gathering overhead, Liora found herself unable to speak, trapped in the gravity of his presence. The closer he came, the harder it became to breathe, to think, to remember why she should be afraid. While her pulse raced uncontrollably, she managed to find her voice, though it emerged as little more than a whisper. "Liora Hale." With every step he took toward her, the bond between them strengthened, solidified, became more real than anything she'd ever known. Strangers around them began to murmur as they sensed what was happening, the older wolves recognizing the signs of a mate bond forming before their eyes. As the bond pulsed between them, stretching and settling into place, King Ryder stopped directly before her. He towered over her, his presence overwhelming all her senses. His scent enveloped her, pine and smoke and something uniquely his that called to her wolf like a siren's song. She felt it, clear as day, the moment his wolf recognized hers. His eyes widened fractionally, the only betrayal of surprise on his otherwise controlled features. For an alpha king to find his mate in such a public, unexpected way was unprecedented. For that mate to be the daughter of a traitor was unthinkable. Her world tilted as he reached out, one hand moving to cup her face. His touch was unexpectedly gentle, almost reverent, his calloused palm warm against her cheek. The contact sent a jolt through both of them, visible in the way his jaw tightened and her breath caught. Something inside her shifted, realigning to accommodate this new reality, this connection that shouldn't be possible but undeniably was. Her wolf, always so careful, so controlled, surged forward with joy, recognizing its other half after a lifetime of waiting. And just like that, everything changed. The carefully constructed walls around her heart, the defenses built through years of isolation and shame, began to crumble beneath the weight of this primal connection. As if the world narrowed to just the two of them, Ryder leaned closer. His voice, when he spoke, was meant for her alone, though many strained to hear. "Fate has an interesting sense of humor, little wolf." Her heart skipped at the intimate address, at the possession already evident in his tone. This close, she could see flecks of silver in his eyes, could count each dark lash, could trace the severe lines of his face that spoke of battles fought and won. A beat later, he straightened to his full height, turning to address the silent crowd while keeping one hand possessively at the small of her back. The heat of his palm burned through the thin fabric of her dress, branding her skin. With his scent in the air all around her, Liora struggled to focus on his words. "The blood moon has blessed us," he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly across the courtyard. "Fate has given what no king can claim by conquest or decree, a true mate." The air thickened with tension as the implications of his words rippled through the crowd. Whispers grew, some excited, others concerned or outright hostile. Liora caught fragments, Beta's daughter and traitor's blood hissed from unknown lips. Time stood still as Ryder's hand tightened at her back, a silent warning to those who would dare question fate's choice. Tonight, he continued, his voice hardening with authority, we celebrate the combat trials and honor our victorious warriors. His gaze swept the crowd, challenging anyone to object. And I introduce to you Liora Hale, chosen by the moon itself as mate to your king. Her voice trembled when she finally found it, words meant only for him though she knew his enhanced hearing would catch them. I never asked for this. As the silence roared around them, his response was equally quiet, equally intense. Neither did I, little wolf. But I will not reject what fate has given. Her breath caught at the possessiveness in his tone, the absolute certainty. There was no question in his mind, no hesitation, he had claimed her as surely as the moon hung in the sky. The space between them burned with unspoken words, with questions and fears and a strange, reluctant anticipation. This was not how Liora had imagined her life unfolding, claimed publicly by a king, bound to a man she'd never met before tonight, thrust suddenly into a spotlight she'd spent her entire life avoiding. Her chest ached with conflicting emotions, fear, confusion, and beneath it all, a treacherous excitement she couldn't quite suppress. Her wolf, usually so in tune with her human side, had already accepted what her mind struggled against, already recognized this man as theirs in a way that defied logic or reason. In the quiet that followed his proclamation, Ryder's hand moved from her back to her wrist, his fingers circling it completely, a gentle but unmistakable restraint. A claiming. A promise. Her thoughts spun wildly as he began to lead her away from the crowd, away from the only life she'd ever known. Behind them, voices rose in confusion and speculation, but the king paid them no mind, his focus entirely on the woman fate had delivered to him. As the echo faded of their footsteps across the courtyard, reality began to sink in. She was being taken, claimed by the Alpha King himself, a man known for his ruthlessness as much as his justice. A man who had killed her father's co-conspirators without mercy after their failed coup. Her name hung in the air between them, spoken in hushed tones by the crowd they left behind. Liora Hale, daughter of a traitor, now mate to the very king her father had betrayed. The irony was not lost on her, nor, she suspected, on Ryder himself. In the stillness that followed them as they entered the royal quarters, guards stepping aside with bowed heads and carefully averted eyes, Liora finally found the courage to ask the question burning in her throat. What happens now? Her bones remembered him somehow, though they'd never met before this night. It was as if her body had been crafted to fit against his, her wolf created to run alongside his own. The bond hummed between them, new and fragile yet unbreakable. As the mark tingled at the base of her neck, not yet a physical bite but the promise of one, Ryder turned to her, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. Now, little wolf, you become mine in truth as well as fate. Her soul answered his without permission, a yearning so deep it frightened her with its intensity. This was what the old stories warned of, the overwhelming pull of a true mate bond, the loss of choice, the surrender of self to something greater. The wind carried his name on her lips, a whisper she hadn't meant to voice. Ryder. Shadows danced between them as he stepped closer, one hand rising to trace the curve of her cheek, her jaw, the vulnerable line of her throat where his mark would soon reside. His touch was fire and ice, burning and soothing in equal measure. Her instincts surged, torn between flight and surrender. The rational part of her mind screamed to run, to fight, to reject this bond that had been thrust upon her without consent or consideration. But her wolf, her treacherous wolf, pressed forward eagerly, recognizing its alpha, its mate, its king. As though fate whispered instructions neither could ignore, Ryder lowered his head until his forehead rested against hers, their breath mingling in the space between them. I did not seek you, he murmured, his voice a low rumble that she felt more than heard. But now that I have found you, I will never let you go. A growl rose in her throat, surprising them both with its defiance. "I am not a possession to be claimed, Your Majesty." As if the forest watched their first battle of wills, silence fell around them. His eyes darkened at her challenge, not with anger but with something far more dangerous: approval, admiration, desire. Her wolf pressed forward, eager and willing despite her human half's resistance. The dichotomy was maddening, wanting to flee even as every cell in her body yearned to press closer, to surrender to the claiming that seemed as inevitable as the tide. And she let it happen, that first surrender, small but significant. She didn't pull away when his lips brushed her forehead in a touch so gentle it belied the strength she knew he possessed. She didn't resist when his arms encircled her, drawing her against the solid wall of his chest. She didn't fight when her own hands rose to rest against him, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her palms. "Not a possession," he agreed, his voice rough with restraint. "A queen." Sunlight streamed across Leora's face, warm and gentle like a lover's caress, except her body knew this was not her bed. The sheets beneath her fingers were impossibly soft, sliding like water against her skin. Foreign. Luxurious. Nothing like the worn cotton she'd known all her life. And then memories flooded back in dizzying waves. The blood moon. The combat trials. The Alpha King's red eyes locking with hers across the courtyard. The bond snapping into place between them with such force it had nearly brought her to her knees. Before she could move, she became aware of another presence in the room. A deep, steady breath that wasn't her own. The scent of pine and smoke and something wildly masculine that made her wolf stir beneath her skin. Without opening her eyes, she knew exactly who watched her from the shadows. "I know you're awake," King Ryder's voice rumbled through the room, sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. Your heartbeat changed. As the silence stretched between them, Liora finally opened her eyes. The chamber that greeted her was nothing short of majestic, high stone ceilings adorned with intricate carvings, tapestries depicting ancient wolf battles draped along walls, and windows that stretched from floor to ceiling revealing a breathtaking view of mountain ranges beyond. With every heartbeat, her awareness of him intensified. He stood by those massive windows, a silhouette cut from darkness against the morning light. Not in royal finery as she'd expected, but in simple black pants and an open white shirt that revealed glimpses of tanned skin and the hard planes of his chest. "Where am I?" she managed, her voice hoarse from sleep. Though she already knew the answer. The royal chambers. His domain. The moment their eyes locked again, the bond pulsed between them, a living thing stretching and settling. His eyes, no longer alpha red but a striking blue that reminded her of glacier ice, studied her with predatory focus. As if pulled by invisible strings, he moved toward her, each step deliberate and controlled. "Where else would I keep my mate but beside me?" he asked, his tone somewhere between genuine curiosity and challenge. Her voice trembled as she pushed herself upright, clutching the silken sheets to her chest though she was still fully clothed in last night's simple dress. "I never agreed to this." Instead of anger, a smile touched the corner of his mouth, small and surprisingly gentle. "Fate doesn't require our agreement, little wolf. Only our acceptance." Between one breath and the next, he was seated at the edge of the bed, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Close enough that her wolf wanted to lean into that warmth, to press against him, to complete what the bond had started. As the bond pulsed between them, Liora fought to maintain her composure. "You can't just take me. I have a life. A home." Without thinking, she shuffled backward, putting precious inches between them. His eyes tracked the movement, narrowing slightly, but he made no move to close the distance she'd created. "Your home is here now," he stated simply, as if discussing something as mundane as the weather rather than the complete upheaval of her existence. With me. While her pulse raced beneath her skin, she searched for words that wouldn't come. How could she explain to this man, this king, what it meant to have choice stripped away? Even if her wolf howled for his touch, her human half rebelled against the presumption, the claiming without consent. Yet despite her internal conflict, she couldn't deny the pull between them, magnetic and primal. Her body recognized his in ways that defied logic or reason, as though they were two pieces of the same ancient puzzle finally brought together. Without warning, he reached forward, one finger tracing the line of her jaw with unexpected gentleness. "You're afraid," he observed, his voice softening. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Her breath caught at his touch, at the jolt of electricity that sparked where skin met skin. "Wouldn't you be," she whispered, "taken from everything you know by a stranger who claims you as his?" In that moment, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even regret, crossing his features before the mask of kingship settled back into place. The tension broke when he stood abruptly, moving back toward the windows. "You are not a prisoner, Liora. But neither can you leave." The bond, he paused, seeming to search for words. "The bond is new. Fragile. Separation now would cause us both discomfort." She felt it, clear as day, the truth in his words. Even the small distance between them within the room created an ache beneath her breastbone, a hollow yearning that would only intensify with greater separation. So this was to be her life now. A gilded cage, no matter how he dressed it in pretty words. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Her world tilted as he turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "Today, you rest. Tomorrow, you begin learning what it means to be mated to the Alpha King." A beat later, a knock at the chamber door interrupted whatever she might have said in response. Ryder's posture changed instantly, subtle but unmistakable, the relaxed man vanishing behind the mantle of kingship as his spine straightened and his shoulders squared. "Enter," he commanded, his voice resonating with authority. As the door swung open, a petite woman with silver-streaked dark hair stepped inside, her arms laden with fabric. She bowed deeply to Ryder before her curious gaze settled on Liora. "My king," she murmured, "the items you requested for the lady." The air thickened with unspoken questions as the woman's eyes darted between them, clearly burning with curiosity about this unexpected development. The entire kingdom would be buzzing with the news by now, their Alpha King claiming a mate during the Blood Moon trials, and not just any woman but the daughter of a traitor. "Thank you, Liora," Ryder said dismissively. "Leave them and go." With his scent in the air around her, Liora watched as the woman, Liora, placed several packages on a nearby table before bowing again and retreating from the room. The door closed with a soft click that somehow felt terribly final. Time stood still as they regarded each other across the chamber. Ryder's expression had softened again now that they were alone, the weight of the crown temporarily set aside. "I didn't ask for this either," he said suddenly, surprising her with his candor. "A king chooses his alliances carefully, plans his mating for political advantage." His eyes held hers, intense and searching. "I did not plan for you, Liora Hale." Her chest ached at the raw honesty in his voice. Neither of them had chosen this bond, this connection that now tied them together more surely than any vow or ceremony could. It had been thrust upon them by forces beyond their control, by fate or the moon or the gods themselves. The space between them burned with everything unsaid. Questions and fears and a strange, reluctant hope that perhaps this unwanted bond might become something more. Something chosen rather than forced. Her thoughts spun wildly as she regarded him, this man who was now irrevocably part of her life, part of her very being. A king. Her mate. A stranger who somehow felt more familiar than her own reflection. As the echo faded of Alara's footsteps in the corridor beyond, Ryder moved toward the door himself. "Rest," he said again, though it sounded more like a plea than a command. "We have much to discuss when I return." In the stillness that followed his departure, Liora finally allowed herself to truly examine her surroundings. The chamber was twice the size of her entire home in the outskirts. Everything spoke of wealth and power, from the intricately carved furniture to the furs piled high on the bed. Her name hung in the air, though no one had spoken it. Liora Hale. No longer just the disgraced Beta's daughter, but the Alpha King's mate. The irony twisted inside her like a knife. Her father had betrayed the previous king, had died for his treachery, and now she was bound to the very bloodline he had plotted against. Her bones remembered an ancient truth: mates were sacred in wolf culture. Whatever else happened, whatever came next, Ryder would not harm her. The bond wouldn't allow it. In that knowledge, she found a small measure of comfort. As the mark tingled at the base of her neck, the place where his claim would eventually be sealed with teeth and blood, Liora rose from the bed on unsteady legs. She approached the packages Alara had delivered, running her fingers over fine fabrics that probably cost more than everything she'd owned in her entire life. Her soul answered a call she hadn't consciously heard, a subtle tugging at the bond between them. Even separated by walls and distance, some part of her reached for him, yearned for his presence. It was terrifying in its intensity, this need that wasn't entirely her own. The wind carried whispers through the partially open window, servants or guards speaking in hushed tones about the king's unexpected mate. About her. About the scandal of her bloodline and the shock of her claiming. Shadows danced across the floor as clouds passed over the sun outside. Liora sank into a chair beside the window, suddenly exhausted despite having just woken. Everything had changed in the span of a single night, her carefully constructed life swept away like leaves in an autumn storm. Her instincts surged with conflicting demands: run, hide, stay, submit. Her wolf, usually so aligned with her human side, seemed a separate entity now, pushing toward acceptance while her mind still rebelled. As though fate whispered reassurance, a strange calm settled over her. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the same strength that had carried her through years of isolation and shame after her father's betrayal. She was Liora Hale, and even the Alpha King himself would soon learn that claiming her was far different from taming her. Whispers followed Liora like shadows, clinging to her skin long after the speakers had passed. 3 days in the royal palace had taught her one immutable truth: the court was a nest of vipers disguised in silk and jewels, their fangs dripping with poison meant specifically for her. And then there was the dress. A creation of midnight blue velvet that hugged her curves before cascading to the floor in a waterfall of fabric that whispered with each step. Lady Alara had delivered it this morning with instructions that left no room for argument. Tonight was the formal presentation of the Alpha King's mate to his court, and Liora would look the part whether she wished to or not. "They'll never accept you," a silky voice declared from behind her as Liora stood alone on the balcony, seeking respite from the suffocating attention inside. She turned to find a stunning woman with copper hair and a smile that never reached her cold green eyes. A trader's daughter wearing royal colors, it's almost comical. From there, Liora measured her response carefully, unwilling to give this stranger the satisfaction of seeing her wounded. "And you are?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral despite the racing of her heart. What followed was a predatory smile that transformed the woman's beauty into something vicious. "Lady Serena Blackthorn, daughter of the Eastern Alpha. I was to be your king's bride before you appeared." Despite that revelation, Liora refused to flinch. No wonder this woman looked at her with such hatred. She had lost a crown, a king, a future, all because fate had intervened. On the other hand, The knowing gleam in Lady Serena's eyes suggested she hadn't surrendered her ambitions so easily. How curious that Ryder would claim someone of your lineage, she continued, circling Liora like a predator assessing prey. Some might question the legitimacy of such a bond. More importantly, Liora realized this wasn't a chance encounter. This was calculated, a test, perhaps, or a warning. The bond speaks for itself, she replied, the words emerging stronger than she felt. As the king himself has acknowledged. In fact, Ryder had been unyielding on this point. Though they had spent little time together since that first morning, his duties keeping him occupied from dawn until dusk, he had made it abundantly clear to his council that the bond was legitimate and beyond question. Not only that, but he had assigned guards to shadow her every move, ostensibly for her protection, though Liora suspected they served equally to prevent any escape attempts. Not that she could leave, the bond's pull grew more insistent with each passing day, the physical ache of even brief separation becoming nearly unbearable. What's worse, her wolf seemed to have developed a mind of its own, constantly pushing toward completion of the bond. Each night when Ryder returned to their chambers, exhausted but still radiating power, her wolf strained beneath her skin, yearning for the claiming bite that would seal their connection permanently. Moments later, Lady Serena's mocking laughter pulled Liora from her thoughts. You actually believe he'll complete the bond? How adorably naive. She leaned closer, her perfume cloying and excessive. A king may need to acknowledge fate's choice, but that doesn't mean he must love it, or remain faithful to it. By the time Liora formulated a response, the woman had already turned away, pausing only to add over her shoulder, enjoy your brief moment in the royal spotlight, little traitor. It won't last. Eventually, the balcony door opened again, revealing not another sneering courtier but Ryder himself. The sight of him stole Liora's breath. Tonight he wore formal attire, black and silver with the royal crest emblazoned across his chest, the ancient crown nestled among his dark hair. He looked every inch the Alpha King, powerful and untouchable. As the truth unraveled between them, Liora realized he had witnessed the encounter with Lady Serena. His expression revealed nothing, but the slight tightening of his jaw spoke volumes. Between them, something cracked in the careful distance they'd maintained. Without a word, he crossed to her, one hand reaching to brush a strand of hair from her face with unexpected tenderness. As her wolf stirred at his proximity, Liora fought to maintain her composure. Your court despises me, she said simply, too exhausted for pretense. With a single glance, his eyes softened, the mask of kingship slipping just enough to reveal the man beneath. They fear what they don't understand, he replied, his deep voice lowered for her ears alone. The bond wasn't expected, it disrupts their carefully laid plans. Her world tilted as his hand cupped her cheek, the warmth of his palm seeping into her skin. I heard what Serena said, he continued, a dangerous edge entering his tone. She will be dealt with. Something inside her shifted at his protective response, a small crack forming in the walls she'd built around her heart. Why haven't you? She began, then faltered, heat rising to her cheeks. And just like that, everything changed between them. His gaze intensified, understanding exactly what she couldn't bring herself to ask. Why hadn't he completed the bond? Why did he keep this careful distance between them, sleeping separately despite sharing chambers, never pushing for more than her reluctant presence? As if the world narrowed to just the two of them, he stepped closer. Because when it happens, Liora, he murmured, his voice dropping to a roughened whisper that sent shivers racing along her spine, it will be your choice as well as mine. Her heart skipped a beat at the raw honesty in his words, at this first acknowledgement that her wishes mattered to him. That despite fate's decree, despite the instinctive pull between them, he would wait for her consent. A beat later, the balcony door opened again, revealing Lady Alara's anxious face. My king, the council awaits your entrance with your... Her eyes flickered to Liora, still uncertain how to address this unexpected queen. With his scent in the air around her, comforting and increasingly familiar, Liora straightened her shoulders. The past 3 days had taught her to recognize the political currents running beneath the surface of palace life. Tonight's presentation wasn't merely formality, it was a statement of Ryder's commitment to their bond despite the court's disapproval. The air thickened with anticipation as Ryder offered his arm. "Ready?" he asked, a question that encompassed far more than just the evening ahead. Time stood still as Liora placed her hand in the crook of his elbow, feeling the solid strength beneath the formal attire. "They'll never accept me," she echoed Serena's words, uncertainty creeping into her voice despite her best efforts. Her voice trembled slightly as she added, "Why do you stand by me when it would be easier to listen to your counsel?" As the silence roared in the wake of her question, his answer was simple yet profound. "Because some things are worth fighting for, little wolf." The space between them burned with unspoken emotion, with possibilities neither was ready to name. This strange connection, forced upon them by fate yet increasingly something they both guarded, had begun to transform into something neither had anticipated. Her chest ached with conflicting desires, to run from the intensity of what was building between them, and paradoxically, to run toward it, to surrender to the bond that called to her blood and bone. In the quiet that followed his declaration, Ryder's free hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles in a gesture so casually intimate it made her breath catch. Her thoughts spun wildly as they prepared to face the court together. 3 days ago, she had been nobody, a disgraced beta's daughter living on the fringes of pack society. Now she stood beside the Alpha King as his chosen mate, about to be presented to the most powerful wolves in the kingdom. As the echo faded of Lady Alara's retreating footsteps, Ryder turned to face her fully. "Before we go in there," he said, his voice pitched low, "there's something you should know." In the stillness that settled between them, his expression softened further. "The court may whisper, but I stand by my choices. By you." Her name hung in the air between them, spoken with a reverence that made her wolf keen with pleasure. "Liora," he said, as though testing the feel of it on his tongue. "My Liora." Her bones remembered an ancient truth in that moment, that mates chosen by fate were meant to complement each other, to strengthen what the other lacked, to create something more powerful than either could be alone. As the mark tingled at the base of her neck, that spot where his claim would eventually be sealed, Liora realized with startling clarity that she was beginning to want his bite. To want the completion of what fate had begun. Her soul answered his unspoken question, her chin lifting with newfound determination. Whatever awaited them beyond those doors, they would face it together. The wind carried the sounds of the gathering within, music and conversation flowing around the edges of the balcony doors. Soon they would enter, and Liora would face the collective judgment of the court, the sneers and whispers she'd endured these past days multiplied tenfold. Shadows danced across Ryder's face as clouds passed over the moon outside, highlighting the strong lines of his jaw, the unexpected gentleness in his eyes when he looked at her. Her instincts surged beneath her skin, her wolf rising to meet the challenge ahead. These nobles with their cold smiles and poisonous words were nothing compared to what she had already survived, the shame of her father's betrayal, the years of isolation that followed. As though fate whispered encouragement in her ear, Liora squared her shoulders and nodded once, decisively. "I'm ready." A growl rose in his throat, not threatening but approving, pleased by her courage. For the first time since the blood moon ceremony, Liora caught a glimpse of the wolf that lurked beneath the kingly exterior, powerful, primal, possessive. As if the forest watched their silent communion, the world beyond the balcony seemed to fall away. There was only this moment, this man, this strangely beautiful connection neither had sought but both were beginning to cherish. Her wolf pressed forward with joy, with acceptance, with a growing desire that matched the heat flickering in Ryder's eyes. And she let it happen, that second surrender, her fingers tightening on his arm, her body leaning subtly toward his, her heart opening just enough to admit the possibility that this forced beginning might lead to something freely chosen, something precious. The gentle press of his lips against her forehead sealed the moment, a benediction, a promise, a glimpse of what might grow between them if given the chance. Together, he murmured against her skin, the word both question and vow. Together, she echoed, and knew that whatever awaited them beyond those doors, she no longer faced it alone. Fire danced across Leora's skin, every nerve ending alive with a yearning so profound it bordered on pain. 2 weeks into her new life at the palace, and the mate bond had transformed from a distant concept into a living, breathing entity that demanded acknowledgement with increasing urgency. And then there were his hands. Strong, gentle hands currently guiding her through the steps of a traditional court dance as moonlight spilled through the high windows of his private chambers. Ryder had dismissed the servants hours ago, leaving them in blissful solitude as music drifted from the ancient phonograph in the corner. "You're thinking too much," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear as he pulled her closer, one palm pressed firmly against the small of her back. "Feel the rhythm, little wolf." From there, Liora surrendered to his guidance, allowing her body to follow his lead. The formal presentation to the court last week had revealed the necessity of such lessons. The Alpha King's mate was expected to display certain social graces, and dancing ranked high among them. What followed was a graceful turn that brought them chest to chest, closer than propriety would allow in public. His scent enveloped her, pine and smoke and something uniquely his that called to her on a primal level. Her wolf stirred beneath her skin, pushing toward the surface with such force that Liora barely suppressed a whimper. Despite that momentary lapse in control, Ryder didn't falter. His expression softened as he recognized the battle raging within her, the human struggling for restraint, the wolf desperate for completion of their bond. On the other hand, the growing intimacy between them extended beyond the physical. Each evening spent in his company revealed new layers to this complex man who ruled the northern clans with both strength and wisdom. He shared stories of his childhood, of the heavy mantle of leadership thrust upon him after his father's untimely death, of his vision for uniting the fractured wolf packs. More importantly, he listened when she spoke. Unlike the sneering courtiers who dismissed her as nothing more than the king's unfortunate fate-chosen mate, Ryder valued her opinions, sought her perspective, treated her as an equal despite the vast differences in their stations. In fact, that unexpected respect had begun to crumble her defenses more effectively than any display of dominance ever could. Night after night, as they dined privately in his chambers or walked the moonlit gardens, Liora found herself increasingly drawn to the man behind the crown. Not only that, but the bond between them had begun to whisper in her blood, carrying impressions of his emotions across the connection they shared. At first, these ghostly sensations had been faint, a brush of concern when she looked tired at breakfast, a flicker of pride when she'd handled a particularly condescending courtier with grace. What's worse, these glimpses into his feelings only intensified her own confusion. The mate bond might have been thrust upon them without choice, but the emotions evolving between them felt dangerously like something else entirely, something freely given rather than fate-imposed. Moments later, the music swelled to its conclusion, yet Ryder made no move to release her from his embrace. They stood in the center of the room, bodies pressed together, hearts beating in synchrony as silence fell around them. By the time Liora gathered courage to meet his gaze, his expression had transformed. The careful restraint he'd maintained since their first meeting had slipped, revealing a hunger that mirrored the ache pulsing through her own body. Eventually, one of his hands rose to cup her cheek, his touch achingly gentle despite the barely leashed power she could feel trembling beneath his skin. "Liora," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. As the truth unraveled between them, she recognized the question in his eyes. He would not take what wasn't freely offered, had proven that repeatedly in the weeks since the blood moon. Despite the primal urges of his wolf, despite his rights as both alpha and mate, he waited for her consent. Between them, something cracked open, raw and vulnerable and terrifying in its implications. The bond hummed with shared desire, with possibilities neither had dared voice aloud. As her wolf stirred, rising eagerly to meet his call, Liora made no move to retreat. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine surrendering not just to fate's decree but to her own awakening heart. With a single glance, she conveyed her permission. His pupils dilated, a ring of red bleeding into the blue of his irises as his wolf responded to her subtle invitation. As if the world narrowed to just the two of them, his head lowered toward hers. The first brush of his lips against hers was hesitant, questioning, offering her one final chance to pull away. Her heart skipped a beat as she leaned into him instead, one hand rising to tangle in the dark silk of his hair, anchoring him to her. The kiss deepened, transforming from gentle exploration to something hungrier, more urgent. A beat later, the bond between them flared to brilliant life, amplifying every sensation until Liora could scarcely tell where her pleasure ended and his began. His arms tightened around her waist, lifting her effortlessly as he guided them backward until her spine met the solid wall. With his scent in the air all around her, with his taste on her tongue, Liora surrendered to the moment. Her fingers traced the strong column of his throat, the broad planes of his shoulders, mapping territory she'd only admired from a distance until now. The air thickened with shared desire as his lips charted a burning path from her mouth to her jaw, then lowered to the sensitive hollow where neck met shoulder, that sacred spot where the claiming bite would seal their bond permanently. Time stood still as his teeth grazed the skin there, not breaking the surface but promising what could follow. The sensation sent lightning through her veins, her back arching instinctively to offer better access, her wolf howling its approval within her mind. Her voice trembled when she finally found it, his name a breathless plea on her lips. Ryder. As the silence roared around them, he froze, his forehead pressing against her shoulder as he fought for control. She could feel the battle raging within him, the alpha wolf demanding completion of the bond, the man unwilling to take such an irrevocable step without absolute certainty. The space between them burned with unspoken words, with questions neither was ready to answer, with a need so profound it threatened to consume them both. Her chest ached as he slowly, reluctantly, pulled back enough to meet her gaze. His eyes had returned to their human blue, though the hunger in them remained undiminished. In the quiet that followed, his thumb traced the curve of her lower lip with exquisite tenderness. "Not like this," he murmured, his voice rough with restraint. "Not with any doubts between us." Her thoughts spun wildly at the implication behind his words, that he wanted more than just the physical completion of their bond. That he sought something deeper, something that couldn't be granted by fate but only freely chosen. As the echo faded of their ragged breathing in the silent room, Liora realized the enormity of what had nearly transpired, and what it would have meant. The claiming wasn't merely physical, it was an irrevocable joining of souls, of lives, of futures. Her name hung in the air between them, unspoken but present in every line of his body as he carefully disentangled himself from their embrace. There was no anger in his withdrawal, only a patience that spoke volumes about the man beneath the alpha's mantle. In the stillness that followed, Liora fought to steady her breathing, to calm the frantic beating of her heart. Her wolf whined in disappointment, still straining toward completion, toward the mate who stood just beyond reach. Her bones remembered his touch, her skin still burning where his hands had mapped their claim. The bond pulsed between them, stronger now after their moment of shared surrender, yet still incomplete. As the mark tingled at the base of her neck, that spot his lips had so recently explored, realization dawned slow and clear. "I don't want to be owned," she whispered, giving voice to the fear that had held her back from the beginning. Her soul answered his silent question as his gaze softened with understanding. "Then stand beside me," he replied, the simple statement containing multitudes, a request rather than a demand, an invitation to partnership rather than possession. The wind carried his words to the deepest corners of her heart, places long shuttered against hope or connection. This man, this king, saw her not as a prize to be claimed but as an equal to be cherished. Shadows danced across the floor between them, physical distance belied by the strengthening connection that bound them together more surely than any royal decree. Her instincts surged with conflicting desires, to cross that distance, to reclaim the heat of moments before, to surrender completely to what every cell in her body recognized as right and necessary and inevitable. As though fate whispered caution in her ear, Liora remained where she stood. What grew between them deserved the gift of time, of certainty uncolored by the bond's insistent pull. A growl rose in his throat, not threatening but filled with promise. "When you come to me, little wolf," he said, each word measured and deliberate, "it will be because you choose me, not because fate decreed it." As if the forest watched their restraint with approval, silence settled over the chamber. The mate bond hummed between them, no longer demanding but patient, willing to wait for the perfect moment of mutual surrender. Her wolf pressed forward one final time before subsiding, somehow satisfied by this promise of eventual completion. For the first time since the blood moon ceremony, Liora felt her two halves, human and wolf, align in perfect harmony. And she let it happen, this fragile peace between wanting and waiting. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles both within the court and within her heart. But tonight, in the quiet aftermath of their first shared passion, something precious had begun to bloom. "Good night, my king," she murmured, a small smile touching her lips as she turned toward her adjoining chamber. His answering smile, warm and genuine and filled with promise, followed her into dreams filled with moonlight and the scent of pine. Dreams of ancient wolves dancing beneath a blood-red moon shattered as Liora bolted upright in bed, her nightgown clinging to sweat-dampened skin. The bond in her chest pulsed with warning, not desire or yearning as it had in recent weeks, but something darker. Fear. Pain. Anger. Emotions not her own flooding through the connection that grew stronger with each passing day. And then the door to her chamber burst open, revealing Ryder silhouetted against the corridor's torchlight. Gone was the gentle suitor who had taught her to dance, who had pulled away when passion threatened to overwhelm reason. In his place stood the Alpha King, eyes crimson with power, muscles coiled for battle. "Pack what you need," he commanded, already moving to her wardrobe, pulling out garments with little regard for what they were. "Only necessities. We leave within the hour." From there, Liora scrambled from the bed, mind still clouded with sleep and confusion. "What's happening?" she asked, catching a heavy cloak he tossed in her direction. What followed was a moment of stillness as Ryder paused, turning to face her fully. The moonlight filtering through her window caught the lines of tension around his mouth, the shadow of something like grief in his eyes. "Rebellion," he said simply. "The Eastern Pacts have declared war." Despite that single-word explanation, Liora knew there was more. The bond between them thrummed with unspoken truths, with knowledge he hesitated to share. "Tell me," she demanded, stepping closer, one hand reaching to grasp his wrist. "All of it." On the other hand, Ryder's expression softened momentarily at her touch, the crimson fading from his eyes as his free hand rose to cup her cheek. "They're using you," he said, voice rough with barely controlled fury. "Your blood. Your lineage. They're claiming the gods sent you to undo the throne." More importantly, his thumb brushed across her cheekbone with infinite tenderness, a gentle caress at odds with the tension radiating from his powerful frame. The Eastern Alpha arrived at the border with 500 warriors. "He demands I renounce you or face civil war." In fact, that explained the maelstrom of emotions she'd felt through their bond, rage at the ultimatum, fear not for himself but for her, determination to protect what was his. And beneath it all, a love so fierce it stole her breath, a devotion she hadn't dared name until this moment of crisis revealed its depths. Not only that, but the realization of what her presence in his life had cost him hit with stunning force. 1 month ago, she had been nothing, a disgraced beta's daughter living in obscurity. Now she was the catalyst for bloodshed, for division among the clans he had worked so hard to unite. What's worse, the rebellion wasn't truly about her at all. She was merely the excuse, the spark igniting long-simmering tensions between the packs. The Eastern Alpha had likely been planning this move for years, waiting for the perfect opportunity to challenge Ryder's rule. Moments later, guards appeared at the doorway, their expressions grim. "The royal caravan is prepared, Your Majesty," the captain announced with a bow. "The secret passage to the northern stronghold has been secured." By the time Liora had dressed and packed a small bag, the palace had transformed into a war camp. Warriors hurried through corridors that had once echoed with courtly music and laughter, armor gleaming in the torchlight, weapons strapped to backs and hips. Servants scurried about with frightened expressions, carrying precious artifacts and documents to safety. Eventually, they reached the underground passage where a small contingent of Ryder's most trusted guards awaited. The Alpha King moved with lethal grace, issuing final commands to his generals, ensuring the defense of the palace and the safety of those who would remain behind. As the truth unraveled between them, Liora realized he intended to send her away, to protect her from the coming storm while he remained to fight. The thought of separation sent panic coursing through her veins, the bond between them protesting violently at the mere suggestion. Between them, something cracked in the careful restraint they'd maintained. Without thought for propriety or the watching eyes of his men, Liora reached for him, fingers curling into the front of his tunic. As her wolf stirred with protective fury, she found herself suddenly, fiercely unwilling to be sheltered like some delicate treasure. "I won't leave you," she declared, her voice steadier than the racing of her heart. With a single glance, his eyes softened even as his jaw set with stubborn determination. "This isn't a choice, little wolf," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "The northern stronghold is impenetrable. You'll be safe there until this is finished." As if the world narrowed to just the two of them, the busy preparations around them faded into distant noise. "And you?" she challenged. "What of your safety?" Her heart skipped a beat as his hand covered hers where it clutched at his tunic. "I am Alpha," he reminded her gently. "I cannot flee while others fight my battles." A beat later, understanding dawned with crystal clarity. This was the first true test of what stood between them, not just the fate-forged bond, but the fragile, precious thing that had begun to grow in its shadow. Trust. Respect. A partnership still finding its footing. With his scent in the air around her, familiar now and desperately needed, Liora made her choice. "Then neither can I," she said, each word weighted with conviction. "Not when those battles are being fought in my name." The air thickened with tension as Ryder's expression darkened. "Liora," he began, warning evident in his tone. Time stood still as she cut him off with a shake of her head. "You asked me to stand beside you," she reminded him, echoing his words from weeks before. "Not behind you, not hidden away in some fortress. Beside you." Her voice trembled slightly as emotion threatened to overwhelm her carefully constructed composure. "If I am to be your queen, your mate, then let me be worthy of those titles." As the silence roared around them, something shifted in Ryder's expression, surprise giving way to reluctant pride, to an admiration he couldn't fully conceal despite his fear for her safety. The space between them burned with everything still unspoken, with decisions balanced on a knife's edge. Around them, his men waited with respectful silence, witnessing this pivotal moment between their king and his chosen mate. Her chest ached with the intensity of her need to stay with him, to face whatever came together rather than separated by miles of forest and mountain. The bond between them seemed to pulse in agreement, strengthening her resolve. In the quiet that followed her declaration, Ryder's thumb traced a gentle path across her knuckles where her hand remained pressed against his chest. He could feel her heartbeat, she knew, strong and steady despite the fear that threatened at the edges of her mind. Her thoughts spun wildly, calculating risks, weighing options. If she remained, she would be both vulnerability and strength for him, a distraction he would protect at all costs, yet also living proof that the bond was real, that fate had chosen her for reasons beyond mortal understanding. As the echo faded of hurried footsteps in the passage beyond, Ryder's expression softened further, something like surrender flickering in the depths of his eyes. Her name hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning when he finally spoke it. "Liora," he said, no longer a command but a question. "Are you certain?" In the stillness that followed his question, she gave him the only answer she could. "I am." Her bones remembered an ancient truth in that moment, that true mates stood together in times of trial, drawing strength from each other rather than seeking safety in separation. Her wolf recognized what her human heart was only beginning to understand, that what bound them now was far more than mystical fate. As the mark tingled at the base of her neck, still unclaimed but increasingly precious, Liora lifted her chin in silent challenge. Whatever came next, be it battle or negotiation or some path as yet unrevealed, they would face it united. Her soul answered the unspoken question in his eyes, offering certainty where doubt had lingered. This was her choice, not fate's decree, not the bond's demand, but her own deliberate decision to stand with him against whatever threatened. The wind carried whispers of movement through the underground passage as final preparations were made above. Time was growing short, decisions needed to be finalized, plans set in motion that would determine the future of the northern clans. Shadows danced across the stone walls as torches flickered, casting Ryder's face in stark relief, highlighting the strength in his jaw, the unexpected vulnerability in his eyes as he studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Her instincts surged with protective ferocity, her wolf rising to meet the threat against their mate with teeth and claws rather than retreat. This rebellion wasn't just an attack on Ryder's rule, it was a direct challenge to their bond, to the future they had only begun to envision together. As though fate whispered encouragement, clarity descended like a mantle across her shoulders. The Eastern Alpha sought to use her bloodline against Ryder, to twist her heritage into a weapon, but perhaps it could become a shield instead. A growl rose in her throat, surprising both of them with its intensity. "My father was a traitor," she acknowledged, the words no longer carrying the sting they once had. "But I am not. Let me prove that to your people." As if the forest watched through stone walls, silence fell across the assembled warriors. The captain of the guard exchanged glances with his men, something like respect dawning in expressions that had previously held only suspicion when regarding their king's mate. Her wolf pressed forward, lending strength and certainty to her stance as she faced Ryder's scrutiny. She was no longer the reluctant mate thrust suddenly into royal life. She was a woman choosing her path, claiming her place, embracing the bond that had once seemed like a prison. And he let it happen, that shift in perspective. His expression transformed, pride replacing concern as he recognized the queen emerging from the shadow of fate's choice. With deliberate movements, he reached for the ceremonial dagger at his hip, the symbol of his royal line, carried by Alpha Kings for generations. "Then we stand together," he declared, offering her the blade hilt first in a gesture so laden with meaning that gasps rippled through the watching guards. This was no mere concession but a public acknowledgement of her as his equal, his partner in rule as well as life. As her fingers closed around the ancient hilt, something fundamental changed between them, a balance shifting, a partnership truly beginning. The blade hummed against her palm, ancient magic recognizing what flowed in her veins despite generations of dormancy. Together, she agreed, the word both promise and oath. His answering smile, fierce and tender and filled with something dangerously close to love, was worth every moment of fear and uncertainty that had preceded this night. Whatever the dawn might bring, they would face it side by side, alpha king and chosen mate, bound by fate but standing by choice. Blood dripped from the ceremonial crown, staining the pristine marble with crimson droplets that echoed the rising dawn outside the palace windows. Liora stared at the ancient symbol of royal power, the crown that should have sealed her position as Ryder's queen in just 12 hours, now abandoned on the floor of their private chambers. And then the letter clutched in her trembling fingers seemed to grow heavier, the words blurring through unshed tears. Ryder's handwriting, strong and decisive like everything about him, filled the parchment with truths she wasn't prepared to face. The Eastern Alpha has agreed to peace talks, but with one non-negotiable condition. I must renounce our bond publicly at tomorrow's coronation or watch our kingdom descend into civil war. Thousands would die, our people, our pack, innocents caught between power and pride. From there, his words became more personal, more painful, piercing the fragile hope she'd nurtured during the weeks since the rebellion began. My duty as king must come before my desires as a man, before even the sacred bond that fate has forged between us. I cannot ask you to witness this betrayal, to stand silently as I deny what has become the truth of my heart as well as my soul. What followed was a plea that broke something essential inside her chest. By the time you read this, I will be in council preparing for tomorrow's ceremony. Don't try to find me, my guards have instructions. A carriage waits in the eastern courtyard to take you wherever you wish to go, with enough gold to start a new life far from the pain I must inflict upon us both. Despite that declaration of noble sacrifice, Liora recognized the cruel reality beneath his honeyed words. He was sending her away, discarding her to appease his enemies, choosing his crown over their bond. All those sweet moments, those tender touches and whispered promises, lies designed to secure her loyalty until she became inconvenient. On the other hand, her wolf howled in denial, refusing to believe the worst of their mate. The bond between them pulsed with confused anguish, searching for truths her human heart couldn't grasp through the haze of betrayal. More importantly, something about the situation felt wrong, discordant, like a false note in a familiar melody. The rider who had defied his counsel to stand beside her, who had handed her his ancestral dagger in front of his warriors, would not abandon their bond so easily, not even for peace. In fact, that realization sparked a dangerous possibility in her mind. What if this wasn't Ryder's choice at all? What if the letter, the crown, the waiting carriage, what if it was all part of some elaborate scheme to remove her from the palace before the coronation? Not only that, but the timing seemed suspiciously convenient. After weeks of failed negotiations, a sudden breakthrough that required her removal? After standing firm against threats and manipulation, a sudden surrender on the eve of formally declaring her his queen? What's worse, if her suspicions proved correct, walking into that carriage might be walking into a trap, not to freedom, but to captivity or death at the hands of those who wished to prevent her union with Ryder permanently. Moments later, determination replaced despair as Liora made her decision. She would leave the palace, but not in the carriage provided, not along the path her enemies expected. She would disappear on her own terms, find safety on her own ground, and discover the truth without the manipulation of those who sought to separate her from her mate. By the time the palace servants came to escort her to the waiting carriage, Liora's chamber stood empty, the balcony doors slightly ajar as the mountain wind rustled the silk curtains. The crown remained where it had fallen, but the letter was gone, tucked safely beneath the bodice of a simple dress worn by a hooded figure already slipping through the palace gardens toward the forest beyond. Eventually, the dense woods closed around her like protective arms, familiar territory after weeks of exploring the palace grounds with Ryder at her side. She paid careful attention during those walks, memorizing paths and landmarks, preparing without conscious intent for a moment just like this. As the truth unraveled with each step away from the palace, Liora's resolve strengthened. If the letter truly came from Ryder, she would not stay to watch him renounce their bond, to become the discarded mate, the queen that never was. And if the letter was forgery, the work of enemies seeking to manipulate them both, she would not play into their hands by remaining where they could control her. Between them, something greater than simple distance grew as Liora pushed deeper into the forest. The bond stretched painfully in her chest, protesting each step that carried her farther from her mate. Her wolf whimpered beneath her skin, confused by this deliberate separation from what it recognized as essential to their very survival. As her wolf stirred with increasing distress, Liora paused beside a crystal stream, cupping cold water to her lips as she fought to calm the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm her carefully constructed composure. With a single glance at her reflection in the water's surface, she barely recognized herself. Gone was the uncertain girl who had entered the palace 2 months ago. In her place stood a woman transformed by love and betrayal, by power and politics, by the unexpected gift of a bond she'd initially rejected but had come to treasure beyond measure. As if the world narrowed to this moment of truth, Liora faced the choice before her. Continue on, find shelter with distant relatives beyond the kingdom's borders, build a new life away from royal machinations and heartbreak. Or return, confront whatever awaited at the palace, whether Ryder's true rejection or an enemy's trap. Her heart skipped with recognition as a twig snapped in the forest behind her. She wasn't alone. Someone had followed her flight from the palace, tracker or protector, enemy or friend, she couldn't yet tell. A beat later, she melted into the underbrush, using skills honed during childhood years spent avoiding notice. The forest had always been her sanctuary, the one place she felt truly herself, and now it offered concealment as she circled back to observe her pursuer. With his scent in the air growing stronger, Liora froze in shocked recognition. Not a palace guard or enemy assassin, but Ryder himself moved through the forest with predatory grace, following her trail with unwavering determination. The air thickened with questions as she watched him pause, head lifting to test the wind. He wore simple clothing rather than royal finery, a sword at his hip, intention evident in every line of his powerful frame. Time stood still as his gaze swept the area where she hid, some instinct guiding him closer to her concealment. "Liora," he called, voice pitched low enough that only she would hear if nearby. "I know you're here. Please." Her voice trembled with conflicted emotion when she finally spoke. "Did you mean what you wrote?" she demanded, remaining hidden. "Are you renouncing our bond tomorrow?" As the silence roared between them, his expression transformed with confusion. "What letter?" he asked, turning slowly, trying to locate her among the dense foliage. "What are you talking about?" The space between them burned with unanswered questions as Liora slowly emerged from hiding, the crumpled parchment clutched in her hand. "This letter," she said, extending it toward him. "Supposedly from you." Her chest ached as understanding dawned in his eyes, followed swiftly by a fury so cold it seemed to lower the temperature of the forest around them. In the quiet that followed, Ryder crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, taking the letter with careful hands that belied the rage evident in his expression as he scanned its contents. Her thoughts spun wildly as she watched emotions play across his face, anger, hurt, and beneath it all, a desperate relief at finding her safe. As the echo faded of rustling leaves around them, he looked up from the parchment, eyes blazing with barely controlled fury. "This is not for me," he said, voice rough with emotion. "Never would I renounce our bond, not for peace, not for the crown, not for anything this world could offer." Her name hung in the air between them, spoken with such reverence that tears sprang unbidden to her eyes. "When I couldn't find you," he continued, moving closer with careful movements as though approaching a frightened animal, "when your guards reported you missing." In the stillness that followed his incomplete thought, Liora saw the truth written plainly across his features, the fear he'd experienced, the panic at her disappearance, the desperate need to find her safe. Her bones remembered the comfort of his embrace before her mind made the conscious decision to close the remaining distance between them. She stepped into the circle of his arms as naturally as breathing, her body recognizing home in a way words could never fully express. As the mark tingled at the base of her neck, that sacred spot still unclaimed, Ryder's arms tightened around her, pulling her against the solid warmth of his chest. Her soul answered his unspoken question, fingers clutching the fabric of his tunic as the bond between them settled into relieved harmony, the pain of separation replaced by the joy of reunion. The wind carried whispers through the branches above, leaves rustling like approving applause at this moment of truth between Alpha King and his chosen mate. Shadows danced across the forest floor as clouds passed overhead, dappling them in patterns of light and darkness that mirrored the challenges they'd faced since fate had thrown them together beneath the blood moon. Her instincts surged with absolute certainty as Ryder's hand cupped her cheek, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. "Someone wants to prevent your coronation tomorrow," he said, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Someone who knows that once you take the crown as my queen, our bond becomes unbreakable by law as well as magic." As though fate whispered warnings through the ancient trees, Liora understood the danger hadn't passed. "Lady Serena," she murmured, pieces falling into place with disturbing clarity. She was to be your bride before the blood moon. She would know your handwriting well enough to forge it convincingly. A growl rose in his throat, confirming her suspicion. She would also have access to the royal chambers, to the crown intended for your coronation. His eyes darkened with promise. "She will answer for this treachery." As if the forest watched their reconciliation with approval, a shaft of sunlight broke through the canopy above, bathing them in golden warmth. Her wolf pressed forward with joyful recognition, all doubts erased by the truth shining in Ryder's eyes. This was their mate, not the author of that cruel letter, but the man who had tracked her through miles of forest, whose relief at finding her safe radiated through their bond like sunshine after storm. And she let it happen, that moment of complete surrender to truth. Rising on tiptoes, she pressed her lips to his in a kiss that spoke of forgiveness, of trust restored, of a bond strengthened rather than broken by this attempted deception. "If you walk away," he whispered against her mouth when they finally parted, "I won't stop you. But I'll never stop loving you." The words, simple yet profound, unlocked something final within her heart. This wasn't fate's decree speaking, or the bond's compulsion, but the man himself, offering choice even now when he could have simply commanded her return. Her answer required no words, written instead in the way she leaned into him once more, in the tears that dampened his shirt, in the absolute certainty flowing through their bond that they would face whatever came next, coronation, enemies, the future itself, together. Moonlight illuminated the ceremonial dagger in Liora's palm, ancient runes etched along its silver blade flaring to life with a soft blue glow that matched the power humming beneath her skin. She had fled the palace as a confused, heartbroken woman, but she would return as something else entirely. Something even she hadn't known existed within her blood. And then she felt it again, that surge of magic awakening from dormancy deep within her veins. The lineage her father had hidden, the power that had slumbered for generations until danger and love had called it forth. Ancient alpha magic, stronger than any seen in the northern clans for centuries. "Focus your intent," her grandmother whispered, frail hands steadying Liora's grip on the ceremonial blade. After fleeing the palace, Liora had sought refuge in the one place no one would think to look, the hidden valley cottage where her father's mother lived in self-imposed exile, guarding secrets older than the kingdom itself. From there, 3 days of revelation had transformed everything Liora thought she knew about herself, about her family's disgrace, about the destiny that had bound her to Ryder beneath the blood moon. What followed was a cascade of memories that still seemed impossible to believe. Her grandmother revealing the truth, that Liora's father hadn't betrayed the previous king out of greed or ambition as everyone believed. He had acted to protect an ancient bloodline that rivaled the royal family's own, a lineage of powerful alphas that predated even Ryder's ancestors. Despite that shocking truth, Liora had struggled to accept what it meant. If my father was protecting our bloodline, why did he never tell me? Why let me believe the shame was deserved? On the other hand, her grandmother's sad smile had held centuries of wisdom. To keep you safe, child. If the royal family had known your potential, they would have eliminated the threat. Better to be thought the daughter of a traitor than hunted as the heir to a rival alpha line. More importantly, that revelation explained why fate had bound her to Ryder beneath the blood moon, not as some cruel jest or random chance, but as destiny's attempt to unite two powerful bloodlines that had once been bitter rivals. The mate bond wasn't just about compatibility, it was about healing ancient divides, about creating something stronger through union rather than conquest. In fact, understanding her heritage had unlocked something dormant within Leora's spirit. The magic that had always hovered just beyond her reach, making her unusually sensitive to moon phases, strengthening her connection to her wolf, suddenly flowed freely through her veins, responsive to her will in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. Not only that, but her grandmother had spent these precious days teaching her to channel this newfound power, to control the alpha magic that few females had ever wielded throughout their pack's long history. What's worse, time was running short. Through the mate bond, Leora could sense Ryder's growing distress at their continued separation. Though he had promised not to force her return, the pain of their bond stretching across the miles affected them both with increasing intensity. Moments later, her grandmother's gentle voice pulled her back to the present. The coronation begins at midnight, the old woman reminded her. If you're to return in time, you must leave now. By the time Leora embraced her grandmother in farewell, the waning gibbous moon hung high overhead, illuminating the path that would lead her back to the palace, back to Ryder, back to the destiny she now chose with full understanding rather than reluctant acceptance. Eventually, the forest thinned as she approached the palace grounds. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their torches creating pools of light in the darkness, but Leora moved between them with newfound confidence, her magic blending her presence with the shadows until she stood at the servants' entrance undetected. As the truth unraveled about her heritage, about her power, about her place in the kingdom's future, Leora felt a strange calm settle over her spirit. No longer the reluctant mate thrust into royal politics, no longer the disgraced beta's daughter seeking acceptance, she returned now as herself, complete and certain. Between them, something profound had changed during their separation. The bond remained, pulsing with steady strength, but it no longer felt like an external force binding them together against their will. Instead, it had become the physical manifestation of a choice they both made freely, to stand together despite challenges, to choose each other despite easier paths. As her wolf stirred with eager anticipation of reunion, Leora slipped through familiar corridors, avoiding the main halls where preparations for the midnight coronation would be underway. She could sense Ryder's presence through their bond, tension, determination, and beneath it all, a longing that matched her own. With a single glance around the corner, she confirmed the passage to the royal chambers remained unguarded, most security focused on the ceremonial hall where nobles and pack leaders from across the kingdom gathered for the impending coronation. As if the forest watched through palace walls, silence wrapped around them like a blessing. The hour grew late, the coronation waited, but this moment between them held precedence over everything else. Her wolf pressed forward eagerly, no longer fighting for control but working in perfect harmony with her human half. For the first time since the blood moon, Leora felt complete, two halves of her nature aligned in common purpose, in shared desire. And she let it happen, the final surrender to what had been building between them since fate first drew their gazes together across the arena. Her head tilted, exposing the unmarked curve of her neck where the claiming bite would seal their bond permanently. "I don't just accept this bond," she whispered, words carrying the weight of sacred vow. "I complete it, on my own terms." His answering smile, tender and fierce and filled with promise, was everything she hadn't known to hope for when this journey began. As he lowered his head toward the offered pulse point at her throat, Leora closed her eyes, surrendering not to fate but to the love they had built together, one challenging step at a time. The claiming bite, when it came, was gentle despite the sharp press of teeth-breaking skin. Pain bloomed briefly before transforming into pleasure so intense it bordered on sacred, their bond flaring to brilliant completion as his blood mingled with hers. The future awaited beyond these chamber doors, a coronation, a kingdom, challenges they would face together as royal mates, as partners, as equals bound by choice as well as destiny. But for now, in this perfect moment of completion, there was only Ryder and Liora, no longer two separate beings but something new and powerful created through their union. Power pulsed beneath the stone floor of the ancient throne room, a heartbeat older than the kingdom itself responding to the united blood of two alpha lineages standing hand in hand before the assembled court. The claiming mark on Liora's neck still tingled with fresh magic, the bond between them no longer just emotion but something tangible that shimmered in the air around them like heat rising from summer stone. And then the massive doors swung open, revealing Lady Serena being escorted in chains between two royal guards. Her copper hair hung in disarray around a face contorted with fury and disbelief as her gaze locked on Liora standing proudly beside Ryder at the throne dais. "Impossible," she hissed, struggling against her restraints. "You were meant to be gone, fled beyond the kingdom's borders by now." From there, silence fell across the gathered nobles as they witnessed the confrontation unfold. The Eastern Alpha, Serena's father, stepped forward from among the assembled dignitaries, his expression carefully neutral despite his daughter's predicament. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, addressing Ryder directly while pointedly ignoring Liora's presence. "You dare accuse a daughter of noble blood without evidence?" What followed was a calm smile from Ryder that held no warmth whatsoever. With deliberate movements, he unfolded the forged letter that had nearly succeeded in driving Liora away forever. Forgery of the royal seal. Theft of ceremonial artifacts. Conspiracy against the crown, he listed, voice carrying effortlessly across the hushed chamber. The evidence speaks for itself. Despite that formal accusation, Liora sensed the tension coiling within him. Through their completed bond, his emotions flowed freely into her consciousness, righteous anger at Serena's betrayal, fierce protectiveness toward Liora, and beneath it all, a steady determination to see justice served. On the other hand, Liora felt no triumph at Serena's downfall. Only a quiet sadness at the lengths to which ambition had driven the woman, at opportunities for alliance now forever lost through treachery. More importantly, she recognized this moment for what it truly was, not just justice for a personal slight, but her first test as Ryder's queen. How she responded now would set the tone for her reign, would demonstrate to the watching nobles whether she possessed the wisdom and strength to stand beside their alpha king. In fact, the completed bond allowed her to feel the collective mood of the gathered court, curiosity, wariness, and in some, a reluctant respect beginning to blossom as they witnessed her composure in the face of her enemy's exposure. Not only that, but her newly awakened alpha magic thrummed beneath her skin, responding to the heightened emotions filling the throne room. Unlike Ryder's power, which manifested as commanding presence and physical dominance, Liora's magic was subtler, perception, empathy, the ability to sense truth beneath facades. What's worse, she could see the political implications unfolding like intricate patterns before her. The Eastern Alpha would not easily accept his daughter's disgrace. His cooperation remained essential for lasting peace, yet justice demanded consequences for Serena's actions. Moments later, Liora stepped forward, her hands still clasped firmly in Ryder's as she addressed the Eastern Alpha directly. "Your daughter sought to prevent our union because she believed it threatened the balance of power," she acknowledged, voice gentle yet carrying authority that surprised even herself. By the time she finished speaking, the Eastern Alpha's expression had shifted from defensive anger to cautious assessment. This was not the intimidated, uncertain female he had expected, the disgraced Beta's daughter thrust unwillingly into royal life. Before him stood a queen in her own right, marked and mated, radiating quiet confidence. Eventually, Ryder squeezed her hand in silent support before addressing the court. "Lady Serena will face consequences for her actions," he declared, "but in recognition of her bloodline and her father's importance to our united kingdom, she will not face execution. As the truth unraveled about Serena's plot, murmurs rippled through the assembled nobles. Some seemed disappointed at the leniency shown, others relieved that outright conflict with the Eastern Pax might yet be avoided. Between them, something profound passed as Liora and Ryder exchanged glances, understanding without words, partnership in its truest form. Through their completed bond, she felt his approval of her intervention, his recognition that mercy might achieve what punishment could not. As her wolf stirred with contentment, Liora turned her attention back to the ceremony that had been interrupted. The coronation awaited, not just Ryder's confirmation as Alpha King for another 7-year term as tradition demanded, but her own formal recognition as his queen and equal. With a single glance at the court historian, who stood clutching ancient scrolls with nervous fingers, Ryder indicated the ceremony should proceed. The elderly wolf cleared his throat, unrolling parchment that crackled with age. As if the world narrowed to encompass only this sacred moment, the historian began reciting the ancient words that had welcomed new rulers for generations. But as he reached the traditional passage about the queen's submission to her king's authority, he faltered, eyes darting uncertainly between Liora and Ryder. Her heart skipped with recognition of what was happening. The traditional vows no longer applied, not with her alpha bloodline awakened, not with their bond completed as equals rather than as ruler and consort. A beat later, Ryder's voice filled the momentary silence. The traditional words no longer serve, he stated, addressing not just the historian but the entire court. We forge a new path, honoring ancient bloodlines united rather than conquered. With his sense surrounding her, comforting and familiar yet still thrilling, Liora faced the assembled nobles who would form the backbone of their rule. Through their bond, she could sense Ryder's emotions, pride in her strength, joy in their union, and beneath it all, a love so profound it threatened to overwhelm them both. The air thickened with anticipation as Ryder turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. No rehearsed words, no ancient script, just truth spoken from heart to heart before witnesses who would carry the tale throughout the kingdom. Time stood still as he began speaking, his deep voice carrying easily across the hushed chamber. I take you not as subject but as equal, he vowed. Not as possession but as partner. Not through conquest but through choice. Her voice trembled slightly as she responded, emotion momentarily overwhelming the composure she'd maintained throughout the ceremony. I stand beside you, she replied, the words emerging with quiet strength. Not behind you. Not beneath you. Beside you in all things. As the silence roared around them, approval radiated from the most unexpected sources, elder wolves whose initial skepticism had been most pronounced, warriors who had doubted her strength, nobles who had dismissed her relevance. The space between them burned with everything they'd overcome to reach this moment, political machinations, personal doubts, ancient prejudices, and the weight of tradition that had never envisioned two alpha bloodlines united through love rather than warfare. Her chest ached with the perfection of this moment as Ryder lifted their joined hands for all to witness. Behold your queen, he declared, pride evident in every syllable. Not by marriage alone, but by blood and bond and birthright. In the quiet that followed his declaration, something remarkable happened. The Eastern Alpha, whose ambition and resentment had fueled much of the resistance to their union, stepped forward and lowered himself to one knee in a gesture of formal submission that sent shock rippling through the gathered court. Her thoughts spun wildly as others followed suit, one by one, then in groups, until the entire assembly knelt before them, acknowledging not just Ryder's continued rule but her place beside him as equal. As the echo faded of rustling fabric and murmured oaths of fealty, Ryder's thumb brushed across her knuckles in a gesture of intimate reassurance meant only for her despite the hundreds of watching eyes. Her name hung in the air, spoken with reverence by the court historian as he placed the queen's crown upon her head, not the traditional circlet of a consort, but a newly forged crown that mirrored Ryder's own in weight and significance.